Okay. So week 6 is everything personnel. We're going to be talking about everything that's required for your employees, your job descriptions, what's required in the job title, hiring process, your new hire orientation process, your ongoing annual training process, how you're going to be evaluating your employees, whether it be a 90-day evaluation, an annual evaluation. So it's everything personnel to include background checks. So what's in your program plan or the sample program plan right now is the minimum amount of standards or protocols you need to have in place. So remember, with all of these standards that I have on here, these protocols that I have on here, you can always add if you feel like your agency needs more of something. But I would not take away from anything that's on here because these are the minimum requirements of what you are needed to have in your program design. So first and foremost, every agency needs to have a job description for every job that you have listed. We will go more into looking at job descriptions when we get into policy and procedures. I will provide you sample job descriptions. We'll need to start narrowing down on what your starting job titles are going to be based upon how many people you have as your partners, how many people you want to hire right from the beginning. But my advice always in the beginning is keep your staff very minimum. Keep it at the bare minimum. Like I was saying at one point, like regional knows you don't have any clients at first, so they don't expect you to have a whole bunch of staff right now. The staff that they do expect you to have in the beginning, meaning day one when you submit your application, would be whoever your administrator is. And the administrator is the person that has to have the bachelor's degree in human services. This is minimum a bachelor's degree. Of course, they can have a master's or doctor's, but they have to have a bachelor's degree in human services. 1 year experience working with the intellectual developmental disability population, preferably in a day program or group home would be super helpful. And then they'll need to take an administrative training that the regional center offers. So that is one person that you definitely will have to have day one when you submit your application.
Okay.
If you're providing behavioral services, you will have to have day one a contractor, either somebody that you have an agreement with, like an independent contractor, that is a BCBA. They will need to know the name of that person, their qualifications they're going to need to see. And they may even ask for samples of their assessments, samples of their previous plans that they have written already. So don't be surprised if samples from your BCBA is required when you submit your application. So
Mhm.
those are the two employees that you must have outside of, I know, Jasmine, you said you guys are going to be providing nursing services. So additionally, you would need to have a nurse on staff day one. So there would be three if you're providing medical services. And then the qualifications for that person, the job description for that person, level of pay, what the starting pay is going to be, all needs to be outlined in the job description. So that's one thing you need to make sure you have as part of your procedures. And like I said, we'll go more into these job descriptions as we get into policy and procedures. Number two, the agency recruitment and hiring process. So this includes any subcontractors or any independent contractors, volunteers. So another good thing, Jasmine, you were talking about the one-to-one staffing for behavioral clients. Remember, you can always hire volunteers. There's always like students in college who, will come in and provide that extra support. Um, just for the experience of working in the field. So that is another great option that you guys can have available to you. As well as if you're going to be providing that continuous education, you can have teachers come in maybe during the summer and do trainings with your clients as volunteers. So this is unpaid work. And you'll be surprised at the amount of people that would be happy to come in and either, come in just because they need, the continual education credits, or they just, want to provide services and supports just out of the love for it. But yeah, do remember that there are options of having volunteers come into the program. But for any new hire, independent contractor, subcontractor, volunteer, you must have three positive reference prior to hiring them. So it doesn't matter if they're volunteers. So everybody is required to have three positive reference prior to being hired or prior to volunteering or being a contractor. Next, the personal records for each employee have to have their application on file. So even if somebody is volunteering, they need to fill out an application. Same thing with the subcontractors. Everybody will need to have an application completed and it needs to be in their personnel record. So all of these people must have a personnel record. And I know they're a volunteer. Why they need a personnel record? You have to have a record for everyone interacting with the clients. Next, everybody must be, all your employees, subcontractors, volunteers need to be 18 years or older and have at least a high school diploma or equivalent. That's mandatory. Again, all employees, subcontractors, volunteers must complete a criminal clearance check. So for California, they will complete that criminal clearance check for all agencies. You guys are not responsible for doing so. You guys are just responsible for providing the information. I believe they're developing a portal now where you can upload all of your employees' information into that portal. And once that information is received, they will make sure to do the background check for all of your employees. Every other state still has to do their own. The agency is responsible to do their own background check. But California is the one state that the regional center will do all of your employees, including yourself as owners. They will manage all of that background checking. So you will need to change this part to match your state standards. Because, like I said, the agency for California agencies are not responsible to do this. They're just responsible to upload the information. Um, Again, every 5 years, each employee, each volunteer, subcontractor has to do another background check. Again, you guys will have to change this for if you're in California because the regional center will do the background check for you. But for other agencies, they, have to have fingerprint cards. Those fingerprint cards have to be sent out. And then it has to be done every 5 years. However, even if you're in California, all of the findings need to be kept on file. So for other agencies, they'll get a list of any, findings in the background. They'll send you the whole sheet. If you're in California, it'll just say qualified or disqualified. You guys won't get to see the offenses or any charges that are on that sheet, but you guys are responsible to keep the sheet that says they're qualified. Their background check is qualified or it's disqualified. For everybody else, they'll need to make sure they just keep the sheet and file with the list of anything. Or if there's nothing on there, it'll say no criminal background, no charges or anything like that. You will keep that list as well. Okay, so every state has disqualifying offenses. Typically, the disqualifying offenses are any felonies is definitely will disqualify anybody from the position. 7 years, or if it's 7 years or less, and it's oh gee, what It's like I don't know why I just lost track of the word I was saying. More so like of aggressive charge. So like any murder charge, anything that has to do with abuse or neglect towards a child or an elderly person. These right off the bat are disqualifying offenses. Each state you'll have a list in your state standards of what the disqualifying offenses are. Make sure you guys keep a list of those because I would include that in my hiring process. You can ask somebody if they have any disqualifying offenses right in your application. You can ask them if they have any felony charges in the application. So we do go more into that in phase two when we look at developing applications for your employees. But that would be something that's good to put on your application as well, just so you don't waste time and energy going through the hiring process with somebody. And it turns out they have a felony charge or any of these disqualifying offenses. Because sometimes these charges, or sometimes the report doesn't come back for weeks. I've seen reports come back months later. So
Oh,
just think if you have somebody, you go through all of this training, you have them working with your clients because they do allow you to work with or they do allow the staff to work with the clients before this background check comes back. They just expect you as the provider to fire them as soon as you see, if the background check comes back as something that's disqualifying. So, which is really crazy. But you can opt not to hire or not to start them until you get the background check. I have seen agencies do that. But it pretty much depends on you know, how much do you need them to start? Like, how detrimental is for you to have somebody to start right away? Can you afford to wait to hire somebody, or do you need somebody right away? It boils down to that when you're looking at whether you want somebody to wait a few months until you get the background check or wait a few weeks until you get the background check back, or if you just what you need them to start right now because you'll be losing client services, client hours because you don't have staff on hand. So it's completely up to your discretion as the agency. But you do have the option to allow them to work before that background check comes back. You just have to make sure you let them go when those findings are not suitable to state standards. Okay. So there's a couple of other checks that agencies have to do that California you won't have to do as an agency, but the state will do them for you. It's Inspector General report, and then there's a list for Medicaid. So if anybody has any fraud in Medicaid, that's another disqualifying offense. You can't work for the agency or can't work for the regional center if you have any Medicaid fraud. So they do check a Medicaid list where it has a list of people that has committed Medicaid fraud, and that will exclude them, unfortunately, from the position. So those two lists are definitely checked to make sure that the employee that you're hiring is not on there. These are checked upon hire and they're checked annually thereafter. So not every 5 years for the Medicaid and OIG. It's every year they're rechecked.
mm, okay.
Um, and then lastly, you'll just need to make sure anybody that has credentials, so nursing credentials, if you are mandated to have a nurse on staff, if you're providing medical services, you should have a nurse on staff. You have to have their credentials and their personnel record, and their credentials must be up to date at all times. So that's mandatory. The same thing if you're providing behavioral services, your BCBA credentials, so the licensing credentials, needs to be on file and it needs to maintain it needs to be up to date. So as soon as one of those licenses or credentials are not up to date, you need to have a backup or you need to pause those services altogether because you're required to have a staff with those credentials hired on staff, contracted throughout the duration of you providing those services. And a criteria for you to provide those services is to have a licensed employee of that nature on staff. So they do periodical checks. They check your employee files when they come out just to make sure these background checks are in there and you've kept a copy. Even in California, I know you guys aren't doing the checks, but you are responsible as the agency to make sure you have records of the findings of those checks and they're in the employee files and they have a date on them. So they want to make sure those dates are in a, compliance with state standards as well as the credentials.
Okay.
Okay. One other thing I want to mention about the BCBA, if you are having the BCBA come in as an independent contractor, you must make sure they have a professional insurance. You will need to have that insurance in their file, and it must be up to date at all times. If they're an employee of you, they're covered because you will have liability insurance that covers all of your employees. If they are not an employee of yours, you will need to make sure you have a copy of their insurance. And it's liability insurance that you'll need to make sure you have a copy of. And whoever your HR person is or whoever is going to be managing your employee files, make sure they're checking. They have a checklist or something that will document when that insurance expires, when the licensing expires, so that they can make sure they're well ahead of that and checking in to make sure they're getting you an up-to-date copy whenever it's required or needed.
Okay.
Okay, so let's talk about training, new hire training, orientation training. So all of your employees, like I said, your independent contractors and your volunteers need to go through this orientation training. So you are required to train everybody at least, there's certain trainings that are required before your employees start. There's certain trainings you can do 60 days after they start. My recommendation would be to train everybody on everything before they start working. It's way easier to track. When you start piecemealing your training, it gets very confusing who took what. And once they start working with a client and they're already, in the groove of working with the client, it's hard to remove them from the floor or working with the client to do the training. So my recommendation would be to make sure you get all of your new hire training done before the employee starts working with the client. It's not mandatory, but it is recommended. Okay, so what you'll need to have is a training sheet for each of your employees. So this includes, even the employees that are transferring, anybody you decide to rehire, they must have a training record. We go a lot into this in the phase 2, like what this training looks like, how you can set it up. But for program design purposes, this training record must have, of course, the the type of training it is. So whether it's orientation or new hire training, that's one. It needs to have the name and the signature of the instructor. It needs to have the date of the training. So if it's multiple days, make sure you put the date next to the training that is attached to whatever date you did it on. Sometimes your training will take 2 to 3 days to get through all of the training. It's definitely a lot of information that's required for all of your employees. So it easy could be a 3 to 5 day training process for your new hire training and your annual training. So, next to the training, like I said, you'll put the date of that particular training, the number of hours. So, just to elaborate more on the number of hours, each state requires a certain amount of hours for each training. So when you're looking through your standards, it's going to outline for abuse and neglect. It must be a 3 hour at least covered for that training. For HIPAA, a 1 hour training. So make sure you have this documented somewhere. What are the required state standard hours for each training? Because as an agency, you're responsible to provide the minimum amount of training. Like, of course, you can go over. If the training is longer, that's perfectly fine. You just note the number of hours. If it is under, there can be some serious, issues that come from that. Like, definitely could be classified as inadequate training, insufficient training. So you want to make sure you meet at least the minimum hours for each of your training, which means you have to set up your trainings accordingly. So just be very mindful of that. Okay, so the number of hours, the topic of subject, so whatever the training topic is, and we're going to go over all of the trainings that are going to be required in a minute. And then your employee's signature. So, like I said, each employee will have this sheet. Not only will the trainer need to sign, the employee must sign to acknowledge that they did receive um, these trainings. And they receive the trainings, they acknowledge, they understand what was explained to them. So their signature must be on the sheet. If their signature is not on the sheet, then it means the training didn't happen. They will not accept the training, which means you'll have to pull the employee from the floor and provide the training all over again if they come out and like audit the employee file. So you want to make sure you cover all these areas and there's checks and balances to make sure none of this is missed. One of the good things that they started to implement since COVID is that the training doesn't have to be face to face. So, a lot of my agencies now that I've been working with are setting up like virtual trainings or online trainings. There's several platforms now that offer online training, so it's self-paced for your employees. So one of the pros to that is, of course, you can minimize, on staffing because you don't have to have an actual trainer designated for 5 days to conduct this training, which is they can be allocated to do something else and just monitor the self-paced training. One of the cons to that is that I've noticed a lot of employees don't retain the information well when it's self-paced. You'll have them come out on, their first day of work, and they won't remember absolutely anything they read, anything they learned, even if there's like tests, competency test that goes along with the training. They won't remember anything they learned, anything they read in training. So you'll be doing a lot more hands-on training after the training. So just be prepared to have it set up where they do a lot more shadowing days if you're going to be providing that online training structure, which is, very convenient, but just have a system in place where they shadow for longer than the typical day. Like typically, employees will shadow 2 to 3 days after they do their 5 days of classroom training. They'll train their shadow with a seasoned staff. They'll walk them through the day to day, and they'll pretty much be showing them the structure, the programming structure when they're out there. Um, Accounting for more days is to account for reteaching them the information that they learn in the sit down training, just in real time, so that you can make sure they grasp that concept. However, some people learn better that way, so it's a win-win for some of your employees. So you just have to, decide as a team, see what's working, and you can set it up one way and switch it over if feel like that way is not working. So it's not set in stone. So if you go, decide to go the online way, it's not to say you can't transfer over to the classroom way. But definitely you have two types of training options. The one thing that doesn't change is you have to train them with the same information, and you still have to make sure they have that training record with all of these checks and balances on there. Okay, let's go down to, let's see, rehire. So, rehire. So, if you're rehiring an employee, within 60 days of separation, they do not have to complete the training. Okay. So, if somebody left for a short while, possibly due to like a family emergency, they had to go out of the country, whatever the case may be, as long as it's within 60 days, the training is still good. So, keep that in mind. All employees must display competency. So I talked about a little bit about adding those tests into your training. I would, you know, every test is not required to have a training, but we'll go through these trainings now, and I'll tell you what tests, you're required to have a competency test. However, it is helpful if you're doing online to make sure every training has a competency test, just because you have no way of testing their knowledge, and all the information is super important. But they must be able to have some type of competency to the information you're providing them. The training topics should be adjusted to meet your individual, your client's needs. So, for example, if you're providing medication administration, so you're an agency that decided to administer medication to your client, you want to make sure you have a training in place that revolves around medication administration. If you're an agency that will not be administering medication, then you don't need that training. It's not a required training. So make sure you look at your services, look at the services you're going to be providing, and make sure your staff are fully trained to provide those services. It could be wheelchairs. So if you're going to be an agency that's assisting clients with wheelchair mobility or access, make sure you train your staff in how to do like transfers if they're transferring clients from the wheelchair to the toilet, from the wheelchair to the seat. You want to make sure you provide those trainings based upon your service, your the services you're going to be providing and the clients you're going to be servicing. So keep that in mind. The trainings that are below are the minimum state mandated trainings. However, you as the agency is responsible to make sure your staff are trained to provide all of the services that you plan on rendering. Um, Okay, so the agency will maintain a system easily viewable to the state government agency. So the regional center will come out and they will review your employee files, like I mentioned. It needs to be in a format where they can easily just look at it. Now, if you're going to be doing electronic, it has to be something that they can have access to. They need to be able to see these employee files. A lot of the agencies still opt to do it in a folder, just like an employee folder, and they just file in the file cabinet. It's just the easiest way to hand the employee's folder to the state and have them look at it. Typically, when the regional center comes out, they only will be asking for two, three, four, five employee files. They're not asking to see all of your files. So it can be a catch 22 if you do electronic version. They may be able to see all of your files unless you lock some. So just be very mindful of that. They will need to have access to those files, but they only give you a list of a select few. They typically do not check all of your employees' files. So you just have to figure out what the best way for your agency is going to be. I still recommend the paper files, like I said, because it's just easy just to hand them a file. The way I recommend setting up these employee files is having a training file, having like a background type where all their credentials are, their background checks are, fingerprinting, things of that nature, their application. So just having two different files, just because the employee file they're looking for, it just makes it easier for them to track the training in one separate file. And we include the test along with the sheet, the training sheet. So, but yeah, we go into a lot of like how to set up files and stuff like that in phase two. So let's move on. We're in E. So subcontractors. Subcontractors will have evidence of training marked with an asterisk mark above in areas pertinent to their roles and functions. So some states, and please check your state standards, some states require subcontractors to do minimum training, so they don't require them to go through all training. Some states require them to go through all training. I recommend you just have them go through all of your training just so that they're fully knowledgeable of your systems and protocols, and the way you deliver your service, like just your service delivery in general. It's super helpful when they're developing plans or training your staff. they can do it in a way that your agency, that's in alignment with your agency. But again, some states don't require subcontractors or volunteers to do every training. But it will be super helpful and make them knowledgeable of your agency standards. Okay, so let's go into orientation. So any new hire training will include, and these are the basic trainings that your new hires, subcontractors and volunteers should have. So intellectual and developmental disability training. So this training essentially will outline what a person with intellectual and developmental disability is, so that your employees can have a clear understanding of who they're supporting, which is super important. Um, the next training would be prevention, recognition of reporting and mistreatment of individuals receiving services, which falls under abuse, neglect, exploitation. Within this curriculum, you have to include any risk factors of abuse, neglect, exploitation, or mistreatment. Any prevention strategies must be included. Any signs that your staff can identify that somebody is experiencing abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Symptoms of mistreatment, including sexual, physical, verbal, mental abuse, excessive force, restraint, adverse intervention, isolation, abandonment, neglect, any serious and injuries of unknown origin, and exploitation. So you must cover all of these areas. Jasmine, I'm not for sure if you guys are going to be utilizing any behavioral intervention techniques, any crisis management techniques, but you definitely want to ensure whatever agency you go with for training that they can clarify excessive use or excessive force, sorry, and restraints, because at one hand, you'll be trained to facilitate a restraint if needed, but you need to make sure it doesn't pass that like fine line of excessive force. So that's very important. I like to mention that to a lot of people that's going to be providing behavioral services, because you are trained to restrain, but it's typically you only restrain when somebody's in adamant danger or an adamant risk of something, happening them, or they're, looking to harm somebody else, harm themselves, of course, where you need to prevent it, and you need to prevent it very quickly. And you're only able to use the restraints you're trained in. Anything outside of that, so if you're using like police holds, which looks very different than the restraints techniques that QBS normally use, or CPI. These are the very popular training centers that train in crisis management. Their restraints are set up so that you reduce any type of injuries to your staff and your clients. So they train you, in a way where it reduces that risk. It's not utilizing excessive force. So it's just very important to be mindful that you're utilizing an agency that doesn't train you to use like any excessive force or anything like that, anything that would intentionally hurt your staff or the client. Okay. Um, and just one more thing I would like to, no, I'll go more down that later. I'll just move on. Okay, so mental health as a co-occurring disorder. So a lot of the time, adults or clients with IDD, they have, other disorders. You need to make sure your staff is fully aware of any co-occurring disorders, depression, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, depending on the age of the clients you're working with. This training is really important because, not only do you want to train them on the intellectual and developmental disability, but you also want to train them on any additional mental health disorders that may come with the client, that may, interfere, be a barrier for their day-to-day life, or even just their daily function and ability. Okay, next D, incident reporting. So incident reporting, you'll want to make sure you train your staff on who you're reporting to, what you're reporting, how to report, what documentation is utilized. A lot of the states now, to include California, they are using portals to document incidents. So you want to make sure your staff is fully trained in incident reporting, and then the timeline of when the incidents are supposed to be reported. We'll go a lot into this when we get to our policy and procedure part. We'll talk about reporting and the types of reporting and what constitutes an incident report. Same thing when we get to our policy procedure part, we'll talk a lot about personal rights and responsibility, making sure your clients are treated with dignity and respect, and due process. So typically due process would be if you're removing a right from your client due to maybe a safety risk. So if you have to restrain a client, that would have to fall under due process, meaning um, you had to take away their right because they were in imminent danger. But any agency cannot, or any of employees of agencies cannot take away any client's rights without due process. So, due process meaning you went to a committee. It's the regional center has a committee. You need to go to the committee and say, we need to remove this person's rights. So, I'll use a very common one, sharps, so knives. You cannot allow this person access to like scissors. Let's say scissors because you're in the day program. You guys more than likely would use scissors. So you have to remove all scissors or all access to scissors to this particular person because they'll cut it themselves, they'll cut somebody else. So you cannot so you can't give everybody else scissors and not give this person scissors unless you go through due process. So this is very, very common. You need to say why you're not allowing them access to scissors, what you guys are doing to help them, manage this barrier, this behavior or concern, and then how you're supporting them through it. So it's a whole process, it's a whole presentation you as an agency has to present. It doesn't happen that common in adult day programs. You see it more in the house because they have to take away their money because of exploitation. So clients can't manage their own money most times. They have to take away their meds because they're overdose. And they, just allow them free access to meds. So they have to just go through due process to explain why they had to take away these items. And, there's typically no issues because you're doing it for reasons that are understandable. Of course, the committee, the team wouldn't want the individual to overdose on medications, wouldn't want the individuals to cut themselves. So they completely get it. However, because they're adults, we just can't decide amongst ourselves that we're going to take this away without having, oversight and agreements and somebody signing off on it. So it's just a process that's put in place to essentially protect the individuals, to give them, the respect and dignity and their personal rights back, so that not just anybody can come in and say, no, you can't do this or that, just because. You have to have a sufficient reason, and it has to be typically for health or safety reasons. Okay, so disaster and emergency preparedness. So every agency has to go through this training. Every agency will have to have a policy. We'll elaborate more on this when we get to our policy and procedure training. But you'll need to make sure that you train your staff on disaster emergency, including fire evacuations and fire extinguishers. If you had a pool, it would include pool or spa safety. I don't come across many agencies that have a pool or a spa, but that would be something that you would put in place. Even if I had one agency that had a pond um, in the back of their agency. So for that reason, we had to put something in place for safety because it was very close to their agency, and it could become a hazard. So you need to have emergency plans. You need to make sure your staff is trained on the emergency plan. So, who to contact, where to go, what to do needs to be included in the plan. We will go over this emergency plan when we get to policy and procedures, so don't worry. Um, the staff, of course, will need the staff and the clients, but for training purposes, this will be mainly geared towards the staff. The staff needs to be aware of all the exits and then the designated meeting spot. So we'll talk a little bit about fire drills and how often they need to be conducted if we haven't already. But um, there needs to be a designated meeting spot close by the building, but further enough so it can, avoid anybody from getting hurt from a fire, of course. Okay, G, medical supports and identifying managing medical emergency. So this is where if you're providing medical support, you'll need to beef up this training to look a little different depending on the services you are providing. So, medical supports and identify managing medical emergency. So you should include topics, about anything concerning to your adults. So if you have anybody with seizures, you want to include that in your training. If you have anybody that's a fall risk, anybody using like a Hoyer lift, in any type of supports that your clients or services are providing, you need to make sure you provide that in this medical supports and identify medical emergencies. You want to elaborate on what constitute a medical emergency in this training. If you don't have a nurse on staff, your go-to would be calling 911. You never want to put your staff in a situation where they have to determine if something's a medical emergency and if something's not. You want to give them some basic guidelines, but if all else fails, if you don't have a medical professional on staff, you want to always revert to just calling 911. If somebody, for example, hit their head, but you're like, it looked like it was pretty hard. I'm not for sure if they hit it hard. They seem like they're a little out of it. Call 911. Just have them checked. You always want to err on the side of caution. And like I said, if you're an agency that does not have a medical staff on hand to make that determination, it's a major liability. I mean, because if you're leaving it for staff or somebody that's like not a medical professional to make that determination, and the person actually ends up having a major head impact and it's caused some serious damage and you find out later, that could be very, very serious. So those are things you want to know in your medical support and identify medical emergency training. Of course, all your staff will be first aid and CPR trained. So within that realm, they're able to
Yes.
manage those type of things. Oh, yes.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so they'll be able to manage those type of things, of course, but anything outside that realm, it will become a liability for your agency. Okay, medication supports, another variation depending on the type of services you're going to be providing. I do not recommend for agencies to administer medication unless you're already a nurse. The reason why I don't recommend agencies to administer medication is because you'll have to have a nurse on staff. Hiring a nurse and having a nurse on staff is a very costly expense in the beginning. So if you, the owner, are a nurse or one of your partners are a nurse, yeah, this is a great area to get into, a great service area to get into because you don't have to hire a nurse on staff in the beginning. But typically for a new agency, paying 50, 60, $70,000 a year is a costly expense, and it's hard to sustain that expense when you're just getting up and running. So medication supports is one of those things. If you're administering medication, you have to have a nurse on staff. So if you are somebody that's going to be administering medication, make sure your training supports your staff through that process. Make sure they're fully trained on what type of medications they're able to administer, who's going to be administering medication. Is it just the nurse? Is it the employees? What type of supports are your staff responsible to provide with somebody on medication? Or do they have access to those side effect sheets? Are they trained to identify those side effects? So just make sure your staff is fully trained where those medications stored. So, if a client comes in with their medication, make sure your staff knows where is that medication supposed to go? How are we supposed to store that medication? Who do we hand it to? All that needs to be outlined in the orientation training so that they're fully aware of your process. Okay. If you are somebody that's going to be administering medication, um, like I was just talking to Jasmine a little earlier, if you're, not going to be administering controlled substance, but a client comes in with a controlled substance, is your staff trained to identify what's a regular medication, what's a controlled substance? So there's a lot of training that needs to be provided if you're going to be providing medical supports, which is why they require you to have a nurse on hand, to kind of assist with that, to kind of oversee that process. Next, standard precautions and infection control. So of course, all your staff need to be trained on standard precautions. Make sure they know where gloves are, make sure they know where the biohazard bin is, what needs to go in there. You should have an area where you maintain like all these universal precaution items, whether it be CPR masks, gowns. Make sure the staff are fully aware how to use that, where to find it, and when to use it. Um, Food handling safety. So they include the food handling safety and the standard precaution infection control training. Um, I don't recommend any agency to serve food. However, your clients should be expected to come in with their lunch. And of course, something to drink throughout the day. A lot of my clients, individuals come in with like snacks, so that's fine, but your staff just need to be trained to support them with that. Whether it go in the microwave, make sure if they're supporting the clients with food, they know how to safely handle food. They have their gloves on, things like that. They don't overheat or underheat people's food. So the training just will revolve around things of that nature. But like I said, you're not making food, you're not, providing food. I mean, if you are, then that it needs to be another conversation. It's not, I wouldn't recommend it. But if you aren't, then yeah, you just need to make sure your staff can just support them with their food that they brought in, especially when it comes to meat. Major liability if your staff is supporting a client that can't heat up their own food and they undercook their food and they're eating like partially hot, partially cold meat. Yeah, that could become an issue, giving somebody a stomach issue. So you just want to make sure you cover these things and the safe food handling. Okay, PCP planning, person-centered goals, plan implementation, and reporting on progress. So as far as person-centered planning, that's PCP, person-centered planning and goals. We talked a lot about this in that assessment area. We talked about who assesses the client, when they assess the client, how they assess the client, within that assessment, how they begin to develop those support plans. Within those support plans, they determine like the person's goals. Within that support plans, it'll say step by step how to implement these services or these supports for the clients. And then, of course, that same person, which is your program director or your BCBA, will be responsible for reporting the progress of these plans. So it's super important, but it's important for you to make sure your staff are fully trained on this process so they know how these plans are developed. They know how important their tracking information is. Um, I can't believe it's already 12 o'clock. Sorry, they know how important their tracking information is. If you guys need to hop off, that's perfectly fine. I didn't realize we were running over. Yeah, so that's fine if you need to hop off, but I'm just gonna finish through all of this before I close out. So yeah, so this is the staff need to know their role in the PCP planning and how they help with the progress of the client and with gathering that information. Okay. I'm going to move straight to HIPAA and confidentiality. So, of course, because we work with medical information, and then, Away, you're a nurse. Jasmine, I believe you're a nurse. You guys are very familiar with HIPAA and confidentiality. So, of course, your staff need to be trained on HIPAA and ensuring the client's confidentiality when it comes to their medical information. I mean, but confidentiality in general is going to be super important, but especially when it comes to their medical information, because you guys are going to have access to all of their medical information to include medications they take, surgeries they've had, doctor's appointment visits. So it's, diagnosis, all of that stuff you're going to have access to that. So you just need to make sure your staff are fully trained on how to manage that information. Okay. Handling conflicts and compliance and grievance procedure. We went over that a lot last week. If a client or their family member is not satisfied, what is the process? So your staff need to be trained in that process as well so that they know if a parent comes to them, how they're supposed to handle that complaint in the discussions that they're supposed to have. And if they're not satisfied once talking to the employee knows who they direct them to. So they need to be fully aware of that process. Positive behavior approaches and support. So if you're going to be managing challenging behavioral concerns for your client, you need to make sure you outline all of your behavior supports and services within this area, and your staff is trained. So you have two options of training your staff in behavioral support. You can have an identified person go to a trainer training where it's called CPI or QBS or safety care. These trainings provide those crisis management type of trainings, those behavior supports type of trainings. So you can have one of your employees or one of your admin become a trainer, and then they can train all of your employees when that time comes, which I think is the best approach to do that. Or you can send your employee there directly. It's a very costly training, which is why I always opt to just say train one person and have them train everybody else. Of course, this person should be a qualified trainer or have the qualifications to train or the ability to train. I mean, they don't need any special qualifications to train, but the trainer's course. But they should be somebody that people can clearly understand, and because it's a very important training, and can get the information across clearly. So, you can also have their agency come to your agency and train your employees. So you can have CPI come to your establishment and train your employees. However, the most affordable way of going about this is just to have that qualified person, your one of your employees, go and take the training and train everybody else. It's between $5,000 and $2,000 training, depending on what type of behaviors you're going to be supporting, how intense of, depending on the severity of the behaviors you're going to be supporting, will dictate the price of the training. So it's a very costly training, which is why I say just train one person and then they come and train everybody else. The training certification is good for a year. So they can just come in and, train everybody within that year that you have coming. And whether, be two employees, five employees at a time, whatever the case may be, they have a year to train everybody. Now, you'll have to renew that training again when the year's up, but it's definitely worth it. Or if you find, you want to train somebody else after that year, you don't want to retrain that person, you also have the option to do that as well. Okay. Ethic boundaries and professional behavior. So really quickly, because you'll be working with vulnerable adults, you need to make sure your staff are fully trained that, they can't have any personal relationships with the employees. I mean, with the client. So they can't go to the client's house, they can't do side jobs for the parent's client or for the client's parents. They can't have any personal relationships with the clients. Um, So yeah, just make sure they clearly understand that professional behavior is very important. A lot of the staff, I see this being a big issue because a lot of the staff feel like, they can have those relationships with the client's parents and it's no big deal. But it's a very slippery slope. Clients will bring our employees gifts, which is crossing that line. So yeah, this gets violated more than not. So just make sure this is fully clear to your employees that those boundaries are super, super important because regional center does not like those gray areas or anybody crossing those boundaries. Okay, documentation. So just the employee's responsibility in documenting all of the client's progress on whatever their support plans are, making sure they document for the business, I mean, for the attendance, which is used for billing. So this is a super important area to make sure that they're trained on. Hands-on training would be that shadowing training that I mentioned where they spend time with a seasoned staff and they actually walk them through the day to day. Like I said, it's normally 2 to 3 days for the average shadowing. However, if you're doing online training, I would say it should be at least a week or two. Like I said, because that when they're doing online training, the information is not retained as well as it is if somebody is training them. So just keep that in mind. Okay, I'm almost done. So I have there's a list of trainings that are recommended for subcontractors and employees and volunteers. However, you all probably, I mean, you could train them in them, but I would recommend they receive outside training or you train an employee to be a trainer. So CPR and first aid, it's a very inexpensive training. I mean, you can partner with another agency that provides this training. It's like $20 to $30. I would say it would cost you more to make it an in-house training because you have to buy all the equipment, you have to pay for the card, you have to pay for the trainer, even though you're training another employee to provide the training. I mean, it's just $20, $30 to train each of your employees as they go through a partnering agency that does this. But yeah, you could opt to do it in-house as well, especially if you already hired somebody or have somebody that's a trainer or certified. Just it's costly to get all the equipment to perform the training. So just keep that in mind. And then lastly, I did touch on this a few minutes ago about the crisis intervention training, safety care CPI. I would recommend having a staff take the trainer's course so that they can train everybody else. It's between five and $2,000. It's a very costly training, but they are able to train everybody. So it's well worth the money to just have somebody go in and take this training. Okay. Evaluating employees. So you are responsible to evaluate all your employees. Like I was saying, you can do it either 90 days or you can do it just annually. A lot of agencies like to conduct a 90-day probational evaluation just because you can let your employees know where they are within those 90 days. You can check in with them and see how they're doing. You can let them know how you feel they're doing. You can decide they're not a good fit at that time, and it'd be okay at that point to get rid of them if it's not working out, or to part ways if it's not working out. So the 90-day evaluation is not mandatory, but it's definitely recommended for that check-in. Okay. Let's see. So I'm just going over the same trainings I just went over. These are just to tell you that your annual orientations will be your annual trainings will be the same as your new hire orientation trainings. So this is just saying your employees will be trained annually. So they'll do the new hire training and annually thereafter. And these are the exact same trainings that they have to take every year. Okay. One thing I want to mention about the job, about the evaluations is the supervisor will clear, carefully evaluate the employee's work performance, based off the job description, which is why it's so important to maintain a copy of that job description. The supervisor will select a rating system. So there should be a rating or a scale system to your evaluation. This is something we talk about a lot in creating your evaluation forms in phase two, but it should be a scale system so you can clearly identify where the employee lies within that scale or the point system that's utilized. So, everybody will be on equal playing fields when their evaluation starts. The program director or the executive director will review and approve the evaluation. So somebody should always review the evaluation after the program supervisor, just to make sure it's fair, make sure there's nothing missing in there, make sure there's nothing additionally they need to add in there. Just want to make sure they sign off on a secondary person signs off on it. The employee's signature the employee will sign it, but it's only indicating that they have, received it, not that they accept it. If the employee does not agree with the evaluation, they should have an opportunity to voice those concerns to voice those reasons as to why, they don't agree. And it should be reviewed and somebody should get back to them within 30 days, um, to address those concerns, to follow up on those concerns, to explain why, those things were put into the evaluation and why, you all felt the need to document this. If the employee, falls below a certain standard and they need to be placed on a plan of correction, um, the scoring definitely should match that. And there definitely should be some check-ins within that plan of correction. Like what you've seen, what you expect to see in the future, what are some of the things they need to work on? And there should be like some check-ins, some regular check-ins when those plan of corrections are developed, whether it be 30 days, 90 days, there should be some check-ins to reevaluate to see if the employee is doing better, getting worse, there's extra training or support required. That's one thing the regional center will require you as an agency to make sure you're checking in and you're not just leaving a deficient staff out there to work with the clients and there's no follow-up, there's no additional training provided to them, but they're continuing to work with the clients because then it becomes a liability concern at that point. Um, so yeah, that is it. Next week, like I said, we'll be doing our last week of program design training. We'll go into the financial management of things. And then after that, we will be starting our financial projections and going into all the costs of the programming, what your revenue is going to look like, what your working capital is going to be needed, and then startup capital. So working capital and startup capital are two separate funding sources. So we'll be going over both. So like I said, that will be what's expected for the next couple of weeks of the training. So yeah, I will send you guys over the video. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Feel free to email me if anything comes up. But yeah, that is it for today. So I'll see you guys all. I don't think we have training next week. Let me see. Is it next week? No, we have training next week. We do not have training the following 2 weeks after that, the 24th, which is Christmas Eve, and the 31st, which is New Year's Eve. But then we will resume again on the 7th. But I'll include that in the email that I send out just as a reminder. So, all right, I will talk to you guys all next time. Thank you.